A San Diego car salesman is murdered while enjoying a quiet evening with his family. Two killers vanish without a trace. Years pass and there are no arrests. Local authorities turn to a federal prosecutor for help. He launches an aggressive investigation that uncovers two conspiracies. One to commit murder, the other to conceal the crime.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Like and subscribe.
When a high-profile homicide investigation turns cold, detectives turn to a tough federal prosecutor for help. For over a decade, Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns spearheaded investigations and fought for justice in the courts of Southern California.
My philosophy was always to be fair, but to be aggressive. In many cases, particularly in the latter parts of my career as a prosecutor, I was dealing with people that had made a career out of committing crime. And the objective in those cases was to convict the person of the latest offense. And in most of the cases, it was to incapacitate the person for the longest possible period of time so they couldn't come out and commit new crimes and have additional victims.
In this episode, the names of some individuals associated with the case have been changed to protect their identities. In San Diego County, in the town of Carlsbad in the late 1980s, 58-year-old Salvatore Ruscitti had been making a living selling cars for almost 30 years. He had a reputation for honesty and integrity. He was well liked by customers. Fellow salesmen thought of him as a mentor. He was a former Milwaukee police officer and a former minor league baseball player. After decades of selling cars for dealerships, Sal was looking forward to opening his own used car lot. September 17th, 1988. Sal Retti was relaxing in his home in Leucadia, California, just outside of San Diego. He was watching television with his wife, daughter, and grandchildren. There was a knock at the front door. His wife, Barbara, answered the door and was greeted by two men. One of them asked to speak with her husband. Barbara told Sal that someone was at the door to see him.
Source of their power. Grandma now.
Can I help you?
Moments later, gunshots rang out. Barbara found her husband lying on the floor. She called 911.
One Adam 31, one boy 31, 10-6. What's your emergency?
The San Diego police responded to the call. Moments later, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics found Sal Retti lying unconscious on the floor, the victim of 3 gunshot wounds. Medics worked desperately to save his life. 15 minutes later, Sal Retti was pronounced dead. The San Diego homicide detectives arrived at the Ruscitti home. The 3-man team began to process the crime scene. One investigator interviewed the victim's wife, Barbara.
Tell me about this.
She described the two men who knocked at the door. She said it was not uncommon for strangers to visit the house to talk to her husband about buying and selling cars. Another investigator interviewed neighbors. One man said he saw two men run from the house and drive away in a dark-colored sedan with its lights off. Near the front door, investigators found 4 bullet casings. Homicide detective Terry Wisniewski was on the scene.
Even though it was dark at the time, our flashlights hit and you could see expended shell casings on the deck. It appeared to be 9mm shell casings. They were identified by the camera deputy and photographed.
Barbara Ruscitti was asked if she knew why anyone might want to kill her husband. She immediately told investigators that her husband was organizing a lawsuit against one of the car dealerships he had worked for. Sal believed the dealership had systematically cheated him and other salesmen on their commissions. Commissions are based on the amount of profit made on a vehicle. Sal was convinced the dealership understated profit margins so it could pay less commission. The suit began with 17 salesmen. But through Sal's efforts, 300 others over a period of 5 years ultimately joined the suit. With so many plaintiffs, the lawsuit could potentially cost the dealership millions of dollars. Barbara Ruscitti also described attempts to persuade her husband to drop the suit.
Mrs. Ruscitti also told us that night that he received an anonymous phone call about 2 weeks prior to the homicide. And in that phone call, he was offered to be sponsored for his own dealership if he would drop out of the lawsuit.
Barbara also described another call, this one more ominous. Sal was told a car would be sent that night to pick him up and take him to meet someone to discuss settling the lawsuit. But Sal was suspicious and declined to take the meeting. Investigators went to the dealership named in the lawsuit. They were told that the dealership had recently been sold. They learned that the purchase agreement contained a clause that indemnified the new owners against Sal Ruscitti's lawsuit because the alleged fraud had taken place before the change of ownership. Detectives learned that the previous owners were Ralph and Lula Mae Osborne. Investigators visited the Osbornes at their home. Mrs. Osborne said that during their ownership, she and her husband had little to do with the daily operations of the dealership. She told detectives to speak to the former manager, her son, Will Nix.
Hi, folks. I'm Will Nix. Here at Will Nix Auto, we can put you in a brand new car no matter what.
Will Nix now had his own successful dealership.
T-Birds, Escorts, and the incredible 1988.
Will Nix sold more cars in Southern California than any other dealership.
$200 a month. So come on down to Will Nix Auto. Do right by you, and we'll get you cruising in style.
Detectives knew that if Sal Ruscitti's lawsuit was successful, it could bankrupt Nix's retired parents. That was enough to give Will Nix a motive for murder and make him a suspect. However, investigators avoided questioning him directly.
Anytime we start to talk to someone that we feel is a suspect in the investigation, we want to know as much as possible about that person and what kind of answers we'd get from him before we even start talking with him.
People who knew Will Nix or were close to him were interviewed, including Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith. Smith said he knew nothing about the murder. and had never heard Nix make any threatening statements about Sal Retti. Smith explained that on the night of the murder, Will Nix took delivery of a brand new Harley Davidson. Nix even had a small party to commemorate the purchase. Based on what Smith told investigators, it seemed Nix had a verifiable alibi. Detectives spent months interviewing dozens of people who knew Will Nix. No one said they were aware of any animosity between the men. No one provided any information about the murder. Several people flat out refused to speak to detectives.
And we were running into a lot of closed doors. People were frightened over the death of Salvatore Ruscitti. People were nervous about the lawsuit. People just were reluctant to talk to us, and some people were actually didn't want to talk to us because they were hiding things regarding their knowledge of the homicide.
The lack of cooperation prevented detectives from gathering any evidence against Will Nix. Despite the efforts of detectives, a year passed with no arrest in the murder of Sal Retti. Although investigators had a suspect with a motive for murder, it wasn't enough. They needed evidence to arm prosecutors in a court of law. First, they would have to break through the wall of silence that surrounded their only suspect. The San Diego Sheriff's Department had spent over a year trying to solve the murder of Sal Retti. Dozens of leads had gone cold, and although the case was still active, investigators began to wonder if they would ever solve the crime. They got their break when a man contacted the police and said he had information about the murder. His name was Eugene Coburn. He was a sales manager at Will Nix Ford. His daughter had dated Will Nix off and on for years.
Mr. Nix
He explained that he hadn't come forward earlier because he feared for his safety and did not want to lose his job. But after a year, his conscience got the better of him. Coburn said it was widely known among Nix's friends that Nix hired Mexican hitmen to murder Sal Retti. Nix also allegedly planned the murder in front of several witnesses. When pressed for proof or evidence, Coburn admitted he had none. It was all hearsay. Investigators needed to corroborate Coburn's story, but with Will Nix still at liberty, investigators were not surprised that none of his associates would admit to hearing anything about a murder plot.
I don't know anything about the murder.
Terry Wisniewski realized he needed help. He had worked on a previous case with Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns. He told Burns about the Ruscitti case and the information that Coburn had given. Burns agreed to take the case.
One of the first pieces of information that Gene Coburn had told the sheriff's detectives was that he had heard through people closely associated with Mr. Nix that the shooter in this case had been recruited from Mexico. And that was an important revelation for us. It was important, first of all, because it gave the federal government a right to be involved.
One of the killers was suspected of crossing the border into the United States from Mexico, where he was believed to have returned after the shooting. Because of the border crossing, the FBI was able to assist in the investigation. Prosecutor Burns and the FBI agents needed to find a way to compel witnesses to reveal what they knew about the murder. They developed a plan that would use the power of a federal grand jury to crack the silence of the witnesses.
The grand jury has the power to compel a person to appear in front of it and to answer questions put. The detectives don't have similar power. They can pursue leads and they can point toward evidence, But ultimately, if, as in this case, the witnesses are unwilling to talk to the police, then they're really stymied, and there's not too many ways for them to go. That's not true with the grand jury. The grand jury can pull people in. If they refuse to answer the questions, they can be put in jail for contempt. They can be held for the life of the grand jury, which in federal court is 18 months. And that kind of compulsion frequently loosens witnesses' tongues.
For Burns's plan to work, he would need the help of the one cooperating witness he had, Eugene Coburn.
We, in the course of the investigation, had him make a number of monitored telephone calls where the monitoring equipment was set up. The agents and I had earphones where we could listen to the conversation.
The plan was to have Coburn call people who might have knowledge about Nix's involvement in the murder. The conversations were tape recorded. During the calls, Coburn would say that he'd been subpoenaed by a grand jury and he didn't know why. He would say he saw Nix's name on the subpoena and wondered what he should or shouldn't tell the grand jury.
What should I do?
One of the first calls that was made by Mr. Coburn at the behest of the investigators was to a person by the name of Jim Walzak. Walzak was in Nix's inner circle at Will Nix Ford. He was one of the sales managers there. And as it turned out, Walzak had heard Nix talking about having Mr. Ruscitti killed, knew that there was planning going on.
With the incriminating statements on tape, the investigators now had evidence that the person had knowledge of the murder.
In many instances, these witnesses were called before the grand jury, and they began before the grand jury, as the trial testimony later revealed, by telling the grand jury that they had no information about the case and they didn't know why they were subpoenaed. And I would let them essentially paint themselves into a corner before the grand jury before I would produce the tape recorder out in the open and play the tape and ask them to listen to their own voice on the tape.
To play a tape for this hearing.
When Walzak denied knowing about the murder, Burns played the tape of his phone conversation. Burns then explained the laws concerning perjury.
The repercussions they may play on you today.
There's a provision of federal law that applies to grand juries, and that provision of federal law says essentially this, that it is a defense to a perjury charge if during a continuous session of a grand jury, although you've made a false statement as a witness, you correct that statement before you leave the grand jury chamber. And I would explain that in detail to each of the witnesses.
Faced with the threat of punishment for perjury, most reluctant witnesses changed their stories and cooperated with the grand jury investigation. FBI agent Jacob Gregory participated in the recording of the phone conversations.
When we joined forces with the sheriff's office, we interviewed a variety of people and quickly discovered that many of the people did not want to talk, but we had suspicions that people knew more than what they were saying, and in a collaborative effort with the sheriff's office and meeting with the prosecutor, Mr. Burns, we decided that we would attempt to get a couple of the witnesses to record some conversations. And we did that, recording phone calls between some witnesses. And that produced a little bit more information.
With each witness who testified before the grand jury,
John, this is
the
James.
phone technique was repeated.
Hey, I just got a subpoena to be
Witnesses were persuaded to make calls to a new round of potential witnesses.
We knew people were being underhanded and dishonest and were trying to keep information from us, and that the only way we were going to get the information was to sucker them into telling us about it. I don't mean anything that exceeded bounds of ethics, but a lot of these people were tricked, essentially tricked into telling us what they knew.
Ultimately, they netted Will Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith. After lying twice to the grand jury, Smith was confronted with evidence that implicated him in the murder.
Just calm down.
He eventually agreed to call Will Nix.
The assistant dealership manager was a gopher for Will Nix. But essentially, he ran personal errands for Nix. He became very involved in the conspiracy and the plot to cover up the murder afterwards.
On June 12, 1990, investigators recorded a phone conversation between Nix and Joseph Smith. Nix was aware of the grand jury investigation. He believed his phone lines were being tapped, although law enforcement never attempted to do so. But Nix's paranoia kept him from saying anything that would implicate him in the murder. Marlene Cavan, Nix's assistant body shop manager, testified at the grand jury hearings. Cavan said that Nix asked his employee Paul Gonzalez to arrange the murder of Ruscitti. FBI agent Russ Baker investigated the Gonzalez connection.
Will Nix liked to pretend he was a real tough guy and liked to associate with other people he believed were tough guys. So Paul portrayed this image at the dealership. Paul made hints that he was associated with the Mexican mafia, that he knew drug dealers and lots of dangerous people, and that Paul was not a person to be messed with either, that he was a dangerous person. Paul was actually not a tough guy. He was just playing this image. Will Nix eventually started to call on Paul's help in situations, and Paul had to start producing. The first time, Will Nix wanted to buy some Uzi submachine guns. He'd seen the movie Scarface, and he thought that was just a great movie, and he wanted to have some Uzi submachine guns to defend his home. And he thought that Paul, being an underworld figure, would be able to get these machine guns for him. Now, at the time, those machine guns were easily bought at any store, and Paul Gonzalez went and bought the Uzis at a local gun show and gave them to Will Nix. But Will Nix gave him the job because he thought he was an underworld figure and could produce for him.
According to the witness, Will Nix approached Gonzalez and asked if he would murder Sal Retti. Gonzalez declined to commit the murder himself, but offered to have it done by professional hitmen. Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith, told investigators how the murder was financed. According to Smith, Nix had a cocaine problem and was supplied on an almost daily basis by drug dealer David Hernandez. Hernandez had supplied Nix with drugs for the past 3 years, delivering a total of $30,000 worth of cocaine. Nix asked Hernandez for a $10,000 loan, but did not tell him what it was for. Nix knew that the borrowed cash would be difficult for investigators to trace. Hernandez agreed to provide the loan. Gates was asked to pick up the money from Hernandez. Nix later told Gates that the money was being given to Paul Gonzalez so he could hire hitmen to kill Sal Retti. The FBI and Sheriff's Department now had enough evidence to make a move to arrest Will Nix and bring him to justice. On May 10, 1991, nearly 3 years after Sal Retti was gunned down, FBI agents arrested Will Nix.
Yes.
He was charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder, with a special circumstance of murder for financial gain. He was also charged with using a firearm in the commission of a crime. When agents searched Nix's home, they found several firearms, including an Uzi with a laser sight. The guns, however, were all legally registered. Nix was taken to the Metropolitan Correction Center to await trial.
He was a cocaine user, he was a drug user, he appeared to have a sizable ego, And he was the type of person who wanted things right away, and when things didn't go his way, he got upset. And he's the type of man who felt threatened by this lawsuit against his mother brought by Sal Retti, and decided that the best way to handle that was to execute him.
Nix's employee Paul Gonzalez was arrested shortly afterwards and was also charged with murder. Gonzalez waived his Miranda rights and agreed to take a polygraph exam. He denied knowing anything about a plan to murder Ruscitti. But the polygraph exam indicated that Gonzalez was lying. Gonzalez was given a final chance to cooperate. In exchange, a judge might consider a lighter sentence.
No, I don't.
Faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Gonzalez relented. He explained that he offered his son-in-law, Albert Vargas, $2,000 to drive the car on the night of the killing. Special Agent Russ Baker.
Vargas offered to do the killing himself for the $10,000. Gonzalez refused as he didn't want his son-in-law to actually shoot someone. In Gonzalez's mind, there was a difference between arranging a murder and actually pulling the trigger yourself. He did not want his son-in-law to be the shooter. Vargas was insistent that he wanted the money.
Eventually, Gonzalez managed to get in touch with a man named Jose Miranda. Miranda's nickname was Tonto. He was a Mexican national who claimed to have committed several contract killings. Finally, Gonzalez recruited his son, Paul Jr., to drive a second car that would be exchanged with the killer's car after the crime. Gonzalez went on to tell investigators that shortly before the murder, Will Nix instructed his personal mechanic to prepare a car that the hitmen could use for the job. He gave the car a tune-up and replaced the license plates with temporary tags which would be difficult for an eyewitness to identify. November 21st, 1991. Gonzalez Sr. and Vargas appeared in U.S. District Court and entered guilty pleas. The same day, Paul Gonzalez Jr. pled guilty in federal court to conspiracy to commit murder for hire. They all agreed to testify in hopes that their cooperation would result in lighter sentences. Jose Tonto Miranda, the suspected shooter, was nowhere to be found. Investigators believed he was hiding in Mexico.
We were told by Paul Gonzalez that this person we came to know as Tonto, the shooter in the case. His true name was Jose Miranda. We tried to verify to the extent we could the identity of this person. The federal agents contacted the postal delivery man at the address that we were given for Jose Miranda, and that person confirmed to the agents that mail had been delivered to that address, addressed to a Jose Miranda. We learned from Paul Gonzalez that shortly after the killing, Jose Miranda went back to Mexico. And when the indictment was issued and the warrant was issued as a result of that indictment, that warrant was given over to Interpol, and it remains active, I'm told, to this day.
The U.S. Border Patrol was alerted to the warrant for the arrest of Jose Miranda. The International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol, was also notified in the hope that Miranda might be apprehended and sent back to the United States for trial. As Larry Burns prepared for trial, he feared that the jury would not believe his key witnesses.
The big problem with this case was the credibility of many of our witnesses. I mean, we had self-confessed murderers testifying for us. Albert Vargas had agreed for a sum of money to go to the door and kill a person that he'd never met before. Paul Gonzalez, seeking advancement within an auto dealership, had willingly involved himself in a murder.
Many witnesses had also lied under oath to a grand jury not once, but twice before.
Mr. Burns, what are the charges in this case? Mr. Gonzalez?
With such dubious witnesses, the prosecutors knew it would not be easy to win their case. The trial of Will Nix began on July 16th at Vista Superior Court. The Honorable J. Morgan Lester presided. One of the first witnesses who testified was James Walczak, Nix's sales manager.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
He testified that Nix was upset about the impact the lawsuit was having on his mother, and he was worried about a similar lawsuit that might be brought against his own dealership.
When Nix would relate...
Walczak also testified about Nix's aggressive personality. Nix liked to refer to himself as the Bull.
Did he ever evoke his nickname, the Bull, to you in some fashion?
Yes, he said, you mess with the bull, you get the horn.
You get the horn.
You get the horn, right.
In the meeting, he said Nix discussed shooting Sal
When
Retti.
Nix would relate to you the effect that the Ruscitti lawsuit was having on his mother, what was his demeanor?
In its cross-examination, the defense established that Walczak and the Ruscitti family had been friendly for many years. The defense attempted to show that Walczak did not take Nix's death threats seriously by asking him if he ever told Sal about them.
And you said nothing.
No, I didn't.
There were witnesses we called who said, look, I knew this was going on. I heard Will Nix talk about offing this guy, having him done. And the obvious follow-up question was, when did you first report it to the authorities? Did you go home that night? Did you try to make an anonymous call to the police to tell them that this thing was afoot? And of course, the response from each of these witnesses was, no, I did nothing. I did nothing. I did nothing either to preserve my position at Will Nix Ford, or because I didn't want to get involved, or because I thought it wouldn't be in my interest, for one reason or another, to bring this to the attention of the authorities. That's hard for people to accept. It's hard for people to accept that someone can be so greedy or so selfish that they wouldn't alert authorities to an impending murder.
I didn't say anything.
The defense argued that any verbal threats Nix had made about Ruscitti could be attributed to Nix's everyday temper and drug problem. Joseph Smith, Will Nix's assistant manager, was the first of the co-conspirators to testify for the prosecution. Smith said he learned of Nix's plans to murder Sal Retti days before the crime took place. He admitted picking up the money from Nix's drug dealer. Smith testified that he was upset when he learned that the money was being used to pay hitmen to kill Sal Retti. Because he did not report the murder plot to authorities, Smith was charged with murder. On cross-examination, the defense attacked Smith's credibility. Smith admitted that he had perjured himself repeatedly during the grand jury hearings.
You told the grand jury that you didn't know Mr. Nix had arranged anything. Was that the truth or a lie?
A lie.
And the second time you testified, you'd been granted immunity. You were lying even though you had immunity?
Yes.
A prosecution then called Will Nix's drug dealer, David Hernandez.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
He testified that a month before the murder, he loaned Nix $10,000. At the time, Hernandez claimed he did not know what the money would be used for. Then he was served a subpoena to appear before the grand jury. A day before his scheduled appearance, Hernandez said he spoke to Will Nix.
I got a subpoena.
Hernandez said Nix instructed him on what to tell the grand jury.
By the grand jury. You been asking about murder for hire.
When did Mr. Nix tell you to tell the grand jury that that money was for a football bet?
It was that same day, there in the parking lot.
And what were his instructions to you regarding your testimony before the grand jury, before you first appeared on the grand jury?
He said to say that it was for a football bet.
In order to pay for this hit, Mr. Nix borrowed cash from a person that he'd had a long relationship with and that he'd bought his drugs from. When that individual was first called before the grand jury, he disclosed to the grand jury that he had loaned Mr. Nix $10,000 around the time of Mr. Ruscitti's murder. But he ascribed the debt as a sports bet that Mr. Nix had gotten in a jam, had made a bad sports bet, and had to pay off. When Mr. Hernandez, David Hernandez, came back before the grand jury several months later, he admitted that that was a lie, that Mr. Nix had told him to tell that story, to give that reason for borrowing the money.
Hernandez also said that Will Nix had offered to supply a lawyer to accompany him to the hearing. Hernandez declined the offer. Now it was time for the prosecution to present the centerpiece of its argument. Paul Gonzalez Sr., the man who admitted to arranging the murder of Sal Retti.
You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
Gonzalez testified that the original plan was to murder Sal Retti at the car dealership where he worked. The public shooting would be a warning to other salesmen to drop the lawsuit against Will Nix's parents. But when he and the hitman arrived at the dealership, Sal was not there. Gonzalez testified that he, his son, Albert Vargas, and Jose Miranda stopped at a nearby payphone to call Will Nix. Nix provided directions to Sal Ruscitti's home. Gonzalez told the court that he wanted to abort the plan. But Nix insisted on going forward because an alibi had already been arranged for that day, the purchase of the new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Gonzalez also testified that Jose Miranda insisted on doing the job because he wanted to get paid. Eventually, Gonzalez said he gave in to the others, and the plan to murder Sal Retti at his home was back on. In its cross-examination, the defense attempted to prove their main argument in Will Nix's defense, that Gonzalez murdered Ruscitti without Nix's knowledge as a way to gain entry to Nix's inner circle. The defense claimed that Nix was unaware that Gonzalez had arranged for the murder of Sal Retti, and that Gonzalez had lied about Nix's involvement to save himself. Albert Vargas was Paul Gonzalez's son-in-law. He offered to drive the hitman for $2,000. Vargas's testimony was critical because he was with the alleged shooter, Jose Miranda, at the time of the murder.
Vargas, will you tell us what happened once you got out of the car?
Well, we walked right up to the door.
Vargas testified that he and Miranda drove to Sal Ruscitti's house. He wore a baseball cap to hide his long hair. He said Barbara Ruscitti answered the door.
You've been waiting long.
Is Sal home?
Yes, just a minute.
And she called her husband. A few seconds later, Sal came to the door. Vargas said he told Miranda that the man at the door was the target. Then Miranda started firing. Now it was the defense's turn to present its case, and the defendant himself would take the stand. Will Nix was a master salesman, a smooth talker who made millions selling cars. By taking the stand, he would begin the most important sales pitch of his life, trying to sell a jury on his innocence. The prosecution used the testimony of 16 witnesses to detail the plan to murder Sal Retti and the conspiracy to cover it up. After 4 days of testimony, the prosecution rested. The prosecution expected that Will Nix would take the stand in his own defense.
As I prepared for the trial of Mr. Nix, I realized that the biggest obstacle that I had to overcome was Mr. Nix's personality. He was a likable fellow. I mean, despite all the excesses in his life, he was bright, he was articulate, he was very, very glib, and he was very persuasive.
So help you God? Yes.
The defense called Will Nix to the stand. His attorney would attempt to show that Paul Gonzalez murdered Sal Retti without Nix's knowledge or consent. Gonzalez was portrayed as a hanger-on, a wannabe willing to do anything to share Will Nix's fast-living lifestyle. Nix said Gonzalez would sometimes bring his son to his home. Gonzalez allegedly told his son that they would one day have a similar home. Will Nix testified about the day after Sal Retti's murder. Paul Gonzalez allegedly turned up at Nix's home with surprising news.
He said, "I took care of that salesman, Sal, the one that's been bothering you and your folks."
Did you make any other comments to him when he said this to you?
I took care of your problem.
Nix testified that he was dumbfounded by Gonzalez's news, that he didn't believe Gonzalez at the
I
time.
know you didn't, but your family was in danger.
Had you had any discussions prior to that point with Mr. Gonzalez about doing harm to Mr. Ruscitti?
No, sir, not at all.
The defense alleged Gonzalez showed up in Nix's office 2 days later. Gonzalez allegedly expected to be rewarded with a promotion for killing Ruscitti.
He came in, he said, "Hey, amigo, I took care of your problem for you. Now when do I get to take over the body shop?"
Nix said he refused to put Gonzalez in charge of the body shop.
I said, "Paul."
According to Nix, Gonzalez reacted angrily.
Did you ever discuss calling the other authorities or anything like that with Mr. Gonzalez?
He just said,
Nix
"What do you
alleged
mean?"
that he didn't notify police because Gonzalez had threatened him.
And he said, before he went out the door, "If any word of this ever gets out, or if I'm ever arrested or picked up in any way, shape, or form, then I'm going to make sure that you live long enough to bury your father and your 2 children."
Prosecutor Burns was concerned that Nix's testimony might carry weight with the jury.
Well, I remember one point him telling the jury that although he thought he ran his dealership, that it was really his mother that was involved, and if they had to tell anyone truthfully who was really the brains behind the outfit, it was his mother. And that kind of self-deprecating humor was well received by the jury. I remember looking over and watching some of the jurors chuckle and think, boy, they're making a connection with this guy, and that's bad for us, because if they believe what he has to say, we lose.
He's dead. Paul would kill him.
Next, the prosecution would get their opportunity to cross-examine Will Nix. For Larry Burns, it would be his final chance to expose Will Nix to the jury as the man who orchestrated the murder of Sal Retti. Successful car dealer Will Nix was standing trial for the 1988 murder of Sal Retti. Because he had taken the stand in his own defense, the prosecution now had their chance to cross-examine him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns would attempt to use Nix's testimony against him. According to Nix's story, Paul Gonzalez's death threats were made 2 days after Gonzalez told him he had killed Ruscitti. The prosecution claimed that Nix had plenty of time to notify authorities.
Mr. Nix, would you explain to this court why you didn't pick up the phone and report Paul Gonzalez on the spot.
Because I didn't believe him.
The taped phone calls the prosecution made during the investigation played an important role in bringing Nix to trial. But no tape recording damaged Nix's defense more than the one in which he blatantly lied to his mother during a prison phone conversation.
Do you remember this conversation?
At one point, his mother called him at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, and she was beside herself. She said, "What's this all about? I mean, how is it that you're in jail for this? I don't understand." And in a very emotionally laden plaintive voice, he told her, "I have no idea. If you think you're confused, imagine me. I mean, the FBI shows up at my house and haul me off to San Diego, and here I am sitting in a jail cell scratching my head of how I've been implicated in this thing."
I don't know what Paul has.
On the tape recording, the jury heard Nix tell his mother that he didn't know why Paul Gonzalez had been arrested. The jury, however, had heard Nix testify that Gonzalez told him he killed Ruscitti.
I said, "Mr. Nix, I want to ask you about what you said to your mother. But before I ask you about that, I want to ask you about the way that you said it. I got to confess to you, Mr. Nix, I listened to this tape, and I listened to your tone of voice, and I was left scratching my head. I really believed you. You sounded like you spoke with great conviction here. Did you anticipate that your mother was going to ask you about this? I mean, did you practice modulating your voice so that you could sound as persuasive as you did?" And of course he had to answer no, that the facility to lie like that, to lie spontaneously and to be very convincing in his lies, came to him, and that it was instinctive with him that he could do that. And it was through that type of examination that I think I was able to convince the jury that the image of Will Nix that they saw in court was very different, that this was a chameleon-type fellow that could put on a face that was very different than the true Will Nix.
After the closing arguments, the fate of Will Nix was in the jury's hands. They had to decide whether Will Nix masterminded Sal Ruscitti's murder, or if Paul Gonzalez acted on his own in an attempt to impress his fast-living boss. After spending 8 days listening to testimony, the jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict.
Find the defendant, William Wayne.
The jury found William Wayne Nix Jr. guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree. The jury also convicted Nix of special circumstances, commission of a murder for financial gain, and using a firearm in the commission of a crime. Will Nix was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He will live in Pelican Bay State Prison until the day he dies. Although the criminal trial was over, Sal Ruscitti's family brought a wrongful death civil suit against Nix.
I was actually called as a witness in that lawsuit, and the end result was the Ruscittis were awarded $2.2 million against Nix.
But Nix anticipated the civil suit and dispersed his assets. To date, the Ruscitti family has not received any of the money from the lawsuit. As for the other conspirators, Rocky Holton, Nix's mechanic, eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received the maximum sentence, 11 years. Paul Gonzalez Jr. was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his role. Paul Gonzalez Sr. faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because of his cooperation, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Albert Vargas received the same sentence, 20 years. Joseph Smith, who admitted being an accessory after the fact, received 3 years. The alleged shooter, Jose Tonto Miranda, is still at large and wanted for murder. The Ruscitti family still hopes that one day he will be brought to justice. A woman is found dead, another critically injured in what appears to be a tragic car accident. When details at the scene lead investigators to believe the accident was meticulously planned, a prosecutor inherits a complicated case that will pit him against a cold-blooded killer in a battle for justice. It was a case that no one in the district attorney's office wanted to take. Armed only with circumstantial evidence, Deputy District Attorney Craig Richman had to prove a man guilty of a shocking and brutal crime amid allegations of a government conspiracy and a massive cover-up.
I was young. This was the biggest case in the courthouse at the time, and probably one of the biggest that this courthouse has ever seen. And I wasn't going to be afraid. And I was going to go at this case as I had any other case and make sure that he didn't get off.
In this episode, the names of some individuals associated with the case have been changed to protect their identities. It was after 4 a.m. on July 22, 1987. A passing motorist stopped to investigate a car accident near an exit ramp off Interstate 5 in Los Angeles. The vehicle had struck a utility pole. Live power lines snapped by the crash hung over the car. Smoke gasoline filled the air. Fearing the electrical sparks could ignite the fuel, the motorist retreated and drove to a nearby truck stop, where he called 911. The LA County Emergency Dispatch Center received the call. The dispatcher immediately alerted the fire department, paramedics, and the Foothill Division of the Los Angeles Police Department. Within minutes, paramedics arrived on the scene. They discovered two women in the front seat of the car. The driver was declared dead at the scene. The passenger, unconscious but still alive, was immediately rushed to the hospital. The Los Angeles City Fire Department arrived at the scene. When firemen inspected the vehicle, the body of the dead driver was still lodged behind the steering wheel. Pools of gasoline were on the floor and the seats. Once the fire department eliminated the fire hazard, the power lines were shut down. The medical examiner removed the body from the car. Noting gasoline in the passenger compartment and that the victim's injuries were more severe than the accident seemed to warrant, the fire captain called Los Angeles arson investigator Michael Camello.
It's kind of unusual for us to respond to an automobile accident. So initially, upon arrival, I was a little curious as to why we were called. Once I was there and able to talk to the first arriving captain and he explained what he found, then I realized that, in fact, it was a good call, and I was happy that he did, in fact, request us to the scene.
On the floor of the vehicle, fire inspectors found a bottle of whiskey, 2/3 full. In the trunk, they uncovered evidence that indicated the crash might be more than a tragic accident. A large empty gas can, some matchsticks, and scraps of partially burned paper and rags, still warm to the touch. There was evidence that a fire had been ignited in the trunk. Underneath the car, investigators found the most intriguing clue of all. A piece of rope hanging from an axle just under the gas tank. One end of the rope was partially burned. When the rope was removed, investigators observed a sharp, flat metal spike attached by a single screw to the undercarriage of the car. The spike was sharpened at one end and positioned several inches from the rear of the gas tank, which was partially full. Investigators believe that when the car hit the pole, the spike was intended to trigger an explosion, burning both victims and destroying all evidence of the crime. The day after the accident, uniformed officers returned to the scene and canvassed the area, but could find no witnesses to the actual crash. Arson investigator Camello would now have to rely on the vehicle and the road to tell the story of what really happened that fatal night.
The vehicle was traveling northbound on San Fernando Road, hit the curb once, about 269 feet from where it actually came to rest, traveled down the street, jumped the curb, and actually hit the pole.
At the end of the road was a concrete wall. If the car had not veered off to the side and had collided head-on with the wall, a deadly chain reaction would have been set in motion. The impact would have caused the metal spike to puncture the gas tank. The burning rope would have ignited the fuel, and the car would have burst into flames. To law enforcement officers, it was clear. This was not a traffic accident. It was a homicide case. Inspector Camello met with Detective Stephen Fisk of the Foothill Homicide Department and briefed him on the details of the case. An investigator was dispatched to the hospital. The survivor of the car wreck was in critical condition. The medical report indicated her injuries were not consistent with a car crash. She appeared to have been beaten about the face and head with a heavy, blunt instrument. The attending physician reported that while lapsing in and out of consciousness, the victim had identified herself to a nurse as Kathleen. Detectives suspected that the woman in the morgue was Kathleen's mother. "41-year-old Claire Peernock had been identified by her California driver's license found in her purse. According to the autopsy report, Claire Peernock's body sustained severe gasoline burns. The cause of death was multiple blows to the skull with a blunt instrument, most likely a tire iron. The autopsy also indicated a level of alcohol in the victim's blood that was 3 times the legal limit. The Cadillac was sent to the San Fernando Crime Lab for analysis. Surprisingly, no fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the car. The absence of even a partial fingerprint suggested to investigators that the dead victim found on the driver's side had not actually been driving, but had merely been placed in that position. A check of the Cadillac's vehicle identification number revealed it was registered to a man named Robert Peno. He had the same address as the two victims of the accident, Claire Peernock and their daughter, Kathleen. Uniformed officers were dispatched to the Peernock residence in an upper-middle-class Los Angeles neighborhood not far from the crash site. But no one answered the door. Police spoke to neighbors. One neighbor said Claire lived in the house with her 18-year-old daughter, Kathleen. Claire had been separated from her husband, Robert Peernock, for several years. Police learned that Robert came around from time to time, and it was not uncommon to hear shouting from within the Peernock household. They would soon learn more. Detective Fisk.
I got a phone call from a close friend of Claire's who had cut off their relationship about 8 years earlier because of the volatile nature of Robert Peernock. She was scared to death of him and heard Claire being threatened by him. This neighbor also heard a conversation where Robert Peernock had said to the youngest daughter, "Wouldn't it be nice if Mommy was killed in a traffic accident?"
The caller also said Claire hated her husband's Cadillac and would never have driven it.
Step in and talk to you for a few minutes about your neighbors. Sure.
Another neighbor, a young woman named Shirley, told officers she and Kathleen were best friends.
Take a few minutes of your time and talk to you about your neighbors across the street.
Shirley told the officers that she'd been with Kathleen the day before the crash. She last saw Kathleen when she dropped her off at the Peernock home around 5:30 p.m. They both noticed the Datsun that Kathleen's father drove, sitting in the driveway. Shirley offered to go inside the house with her friend as she knew Kathleen's father was often abusive.
I'll be here. Bye.
But Kathleen said no, it would be all right. The two girls had planned to go out later that evening. Shirley called repeatedly to confirm their plans, but there was no answer. Shirley even stopped by the Peernock house later that evening, hoping to find Kathleen. But no one came to the door. After knocking for several minutes, Shirley and her friends departed. The lights in the house had been on, Shirley recalled. And Mr. Peernock's cars, the small Datsun he drove and the vintage Cadillac Eldorado, had been parked in the driveway at the time.
Please call us. Let us know.
On a tip from one of Claire Peernock's neighbors, investigators contacted Robert Peernock in nearby Tarzana, where he was living with his girlfriend.
Hello. Can I speak with Robert Peernock, please?
Right.
Peernock said he knew nothing of the accident.
Why?
He promised to stop by the precinct later that morning. But Robert Peernock never reported to the police station. When detectives learned that Kathleen had regained consciousness and was able to speak, they returned to the hospital. Kathleen's memory had steadily improved in the last 48 hours. The images that she recalled of her last night at home frightened her, and the story she told the detective was bone-chilling. She had hoped to avoid fighting with her father that evening. As she microwaved her dinner, Robert Peernock began complaining about the utility bills that he was still
Every light in
paying.
the house, the air conditioning, full blast.
Why are you yelling at me?
Kathleen responded with a sarcastic remark.
You think I'm gonna pay this?
Enraged, Peernock leapt at his daughter, grabbing her by the neck.
Come back here!
What are you doing?
You got angry about it?
you try to hit him at all?
Kathleen struggled, she explained, but she could not break free, and he pinned her to the floor.
It didn't last very long. Have you found him?
As suddenly as the attack began, it stopped. He removed his hands from his daughter's throat. He asked her if she was okay. She replied that she would live, and he said he had something that would make her feel better. Kathleen had no idea, she told authorities, what her father meant by that comment. She was just glad the worst was over. Unfortunately for Kathleen, her night of terror was only just beginning.
I'm down. Shh.
In July 1987, Kathleen and her mother, Claire Peernock, were bludgeoned, soaked in gasoline, and left to die in a car that was rigged to explode. Her mother died, but Kathleen survived. Investigators patiently waited 48 hours for her to fully regain consciousness. Now they hope to gain a clearer understanding of the events that transpired on that warm summer night. Kathleen recalled having a brutal fight with her father that evening. After he regained his composure, he had stepped outside, claiming he had something that would make her feel better.
What is that? What is that?
Okay.
Moments later,
All right, now,
he returned and slipped a pair of handcuffs on her wrists.
Down, relax. No problem.
He forced her onto the couch
What are you doing?
and pulled a canvas hood over her head.
Oh, come on.
Peernock pushed a plastic tube down her throat. Using a spray bottle, he sprayed alcohol into the tube, forcing her to drink. He was going to get her and her mother drunk, he had said, and make his wife sign some papers,
He was wasting electricity and...
after which he would be out of their lives forever.
What did he do then?
He tossed Kathleen on the bed in her mother's room, turned on the radio, and then rummaged through the dresser drawers. Even though he and Claire had been separated for several years, he still had various possessions of his own tucked in corners of the house, including a gun. He placed the barrel of the gun near her ear and pulled the trigger. The chamber was empty. "If you don't cooperate," he told her, "I'll blow your brains out." Her father bound her ankles with rope and pulled her legs up, knotting the rope around the handcuffs. Then he left the room. He returned occasionally, she explained, to force-feed her more alcohol. She was also forced to swallow pills. Robert Peernock left his daughter on her mother's bed, hog-tied and unable to see, for hours. At one point, she thought she heard some loud thuds coming from another part of the house. Had her mother come home from work yet? Were her parents fighting? She couldn't be sure. Police would later learn that throughout the ordeal, Kathleen's friend Shirley had been trying to reach her. Hours passed, and the alcohol and pills took their toll. Kathleen was barely conscious when she sensed someone carrying her outside and placing her in a car. There, the images continued to blur, and she could remember no more. After Kathleen's interview, investigators obtained a warrant for Robert Peernock's arrest. Search warrants were issued for both the home where Kathleen was brutalized and Robert's condominium, Police had no information as to the whereabouts of the fugitive. Detective Fisk and his team of investigators needed to find clues that would help them locate the suspect and link him to the crime. They needed to work fast.
Right after this crime occurred, the chase was on, and we were getting search warrants for bank records, find out where he banked, trying to find out how much money he had, trying to find out where he owned property. We were trying to find out where the crime actually occurred. The beating obviously didn't take place in the car. Because of the severity of these wounds, you couldn't swing an object hard enough to cause these injuries inside a car.
Police found a scrap of rope in the bedroom where Kathleen had been held, as well as cartons of papers, folders, and files that Robert Peernock had left around the house. There was, however, no sign of the suspect. Investigators worried that with each passing day, the trail was growing colder. A surveillance team was assigned to trail Peernock's girlfriend, Sonia Siegel. She was observed making a number of phone calls from payphones, but she did not lead the detectives to Peernock. After 2 weeks, police found Peernock's gray Datsun. The car was impounded and searched. Inside, investigators found more notes, receipts, and other paperwork. 2 guns, one an automatic pistol, the other a revolver with a wooden handle, and a collection of tools, including a vise. Vices often leave tiny indentation marks on any tools placed in their grip. Investigators compared the crosshatch design of Peernock's vise with the indentations found on the metal spike that had been attached to the bottom of the Cadillac. The indentations matched.
What can I help you with?
Well, ma'am,
Investigators next met with a private attorney named Victoria Doom. She told the detective that 9 months before the accident, Claire Peernock had asked her to begin divorce proceedings. The attorney found that her client's husband, Robert Peernock, was surprisingly receptive to the wishes of his wife. In fact, as long as she agreed to postpone the divorce, giving him time to finish a few business deals, Peernock agreed to split their assets evenly.
I'll be getting in touch with you. Okay. Please be. It's okay. Okay.
just as if they had the stock market. Okay.
Those assets included 3 houses in Southern California, 4 bank accounts, and more than a dozen life insurance policies totaling more than $1.5 million.
In fact, would it be possible to have a...
He wanted to hold off on
Investigators now believed they had found a motive for the murder. But Peernock was still at large.
with the insurance plan.
On September 3rd, 5 weeks after the accident, Sonia Siegel was brought in for questioning. Investigators were convinced she knew where the suspect was hiding. But as detectives tried to wear her down, it became clear that Peernock had told her he was being framed, and that she believed he was innocent.
I don't know.
Investigators told Sonia if she didn't cooperate, she could be charged as an accessory to murder. The pressure worked. Sonia said Peernock was staying at a motel near San Fernando, California.
You just be quiet here.
Can I help you?
Back to the door. Down the ground.
Finally, after more than a month, the LAPD had their man. And perhaps just in time. In the motel room, detectives found more than $25,000 in cash, a packed suitcase, and a traveler's guide to Australia. The case could now be turned over to the district attorney's office. But even though Peernock was now behind bars, he didn't go quietly. The prosecutors would soon experience firsthand his brutal temper. In September 1987, Robert John Peernock was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife Claire, the attempted murder of his 18-year-old daughter Kathleen, and kidnapping. He pleaded not guilty on all charges. Craig Richman had been a deputy district attorney for 3 years when he was assigned the Peernock case.
This was a circumstantial evidence case to a large extent because we didn't have that one person who could say, I saw him beating his wife, putting him in the car, and sending him down the road.
The prosecutor had Peernock's daughter, who could testify to what had happened earlier in the evening. But she couldn't say who put her in the car because her head was covered. The prosecutor also had no murder weapon. The blunt instrument used to beat Claire Peernock and Kathleen was never found. To make up for these weaknesses in his case, Deputy District Attorney Richman knew his team would have to collect as much evidence as possible to prove Robert Peernock's guilt. Richman hoped to find such evidence by examining the month Peernock spent in hiding. He turned to the case files filled with receipts, phone records, and credit card bills. The paper trail began just hours after the crime was discovered. On July 23rd at 9 a.m., one day after the fatal crash, bank records showed that Peernock withdrew $40,000 in cash from one of his accounts. From there, Peernock drove to a parking lot near the airport. He left his car and flew to Las Vegas, checking into a hotel under an assumed name. In early August, Robert visited a plastic surgeon in Las Vegas. He underwent a facelift, a chin implant, and an eye tuck.
Mr. Peernock, the doctor will see you.
He moved from hotel to hotel for several weeks until he was arrested back in California.
Here's his wife who's been killed and his daughter who's been almost killed, and he is left to go to Las Vegas, register under assumed names, getting plastic surgery, doesn't come to the funeral, doesn't care about what's going on with his daughter. I thought that that was all a very damning piece of evidence.
You and your firm and your little tape recorder.
After a hearing which determined the defendant was mentally competent to stand trial, Peernock found ways to postpone his trial for over 3 years.
Good luck to you.
He went through 5 defense attorneys, firing each in turn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. You have a good day.
For several months, he defended himself, confident that he'd prove his innocence at trial and expose what he claimed was a government plot to frame him and destroy his family. Although Peernock's claims were far-fetched, they were rooted in fact. As Deputy District Attorney Craig Richman investigated the man's background, he discovered that in the 1970s, Peernock had uncovered corruption at California's Department of Water Resources, a state agency where he worked at the time. He'd become known as a whistleblower. The Robert Peernock investigation and trial was the subject of a book by Anthony Flacco.
At the time this murder took place, his explanation was he was about to publish a book tracing this corruption all the way to the governor's office, and that for that reason, it wasn't even enough for these forces to kill him, that they had to frame him and discredit him so that if the book was ever discovered, what he revealed in it wouldn't be believed.
The prosecution realized that what sounded like paranoid ravings to some jurors might ring true for others. And there was evidence that while serving as a whistleblower, Peernock's reputation had been smeared. He'd even received death threats.
Well, I was always concerned with his conspiracy theory. I have 12 people that I have to convince beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed this murder. And sometimes people, jurors, unfortunately, believe in strange things. And I was concerned that someone up there might buy into this conspiracy theory somehow and could prevent me from convicting him.
In the midst of preparing for the case, there was an unexpected development. When an inmate came forward with information on Robert Peernock, investigators were called to the county jail. There, they learned that Peernock, from behind bars, had been plotting the murder of his daughter. According to investigators, Peernock also planned to kill Victoria Doom, his wife's former divorce attorney, who now represented Kathleen. The two were framing him for his wife's murder, Peernock told the inmate, and they were trying to take his money. Victoria Doom had encouraged Kathleen to file a civil lawsuit against her father for the wrongful death of her mother and for her own injuries. The inmate agreed to wear a wire.
Phone call, everything's straight.
He caught Peernock on tape discussing the plot. 2 counts of solicitation to commit murder were added to his charges. In 1991, he hired his 6th attorney, Donald Green. Determined to end the delays, the judge ordered Green to represent the defendant throughout the entire trial. Now, after 3 years, Robert Peernock would have his day in court. The trial of Robert John Peernock began in the summer of 1991.
All rise for the Honorable Judge Howard Schwab.
It had been exactly 4 years since his wife and daughter were discovered brutally beaten inside his car, which had been soaked with gasoline and rigged to explode.
Prosecution is present. Prosecution, you can call your witness.
Prosecution calls Dr. James Wagner.
The prosecution's first witness was Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. James Wagner, who testified to the nature and severity of the wounds inflicted on both Claire Peernock and Kathleen.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the
Unable
truth?
to show the jury the actual weapon, the prosecution supplied a prop, asking the coroner to demonstrate the way in which each blow was delivered, based on his examination of Claire Peernock's body.
Stand about arm's length in front of me. Okay.
Jurors watched in silence as the coroner reenacted 4 severe blows to the head, centered right between the eyes.
With the final one being a totally
Unlike a simple fracture, the repeated blunt force trauma caused the entire skull to shatter into small fragments, like a broken eggshell.
to the ground?
In that general vicinity of degrees, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy District Attorney Craig Richman.
Her wounds are very isolated in one location on her forehead, lending us to believe that she is unconscious and he is striking the same spot over and over again like you would hit a nail with a hammer.
Detective Stephen Fisk testified about the defendant's jailhouse plot to murder his daughter and her attorney. Richmond played for jurors the recorded conversation of Peernock and a prison inmate who wore a hidden microphone. On the tape, Peernock said his trial would begin in 1 week, and his daughter had to be killed by the weekend. The inmate told Peernock he would have the job done for $15,000. Peernock accepted the price. For jurors, the conversation was a frightening glimpse into the mind of a man who seemed to have no hesitation about killing his own daughter. But Richman knew he now had to link the suspect to the murder of his wife. Richman entered into evidence boxes of papers, receipts, and notes that Detective Fisk and his investigators had recovered from the defendant.
Yes, it is. That's correct.
Well, Robert Peernock was a highly organized, almost compulsive man who made lists for everything he did every day. Go to the store, get a haircut. The most mundane activities were all written down on lists that he followed. When he organized this crime, he saved all his lists.
As compelling as any witness, the notes, written in Peernock's own hand, outlined the slow, methodical way in which he plotted his crimes. Hunting for clues, Richman had made a painstaking search through hundreds of documents.
As trial was approaching, it was something that just could not be put off anymore, that I had to just see if there was anything that might help me prove this case. So I came here on the weekend and just started plowing through the boxes one at a time, going through literally one piece of paper at a time of reams and reams of papers with notes on them.
For hours, Richman examined the notes documenting the various activities that made up Peernock's days. Then, on one small scrap of paper, he noticed a list with the entry, "Check underneath car." And another, "Get statements straight." On yet another list, the prosecutor found a drawing that resembled the metal spike that was found underneath the car. It was, he determined, a checklist for murder.
One of the notes was W and C and back seat and cover, which I assume meant wife and child in the back seat and cover them up. Handcuffs, hoods, liquor bottles. Remember to bring her purse. Can't have her driving the car without her purse. So there was a note, bring purse. There was enough there to show that this was his checklist of how he was going to commit the crime.
According to Fisk's testimony, some of the notes were dated, indicating that Peernock had been planning the crime for months.
Witness, you're excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Next, the prosecution would reveal the technical details of Peernock's plan for the murder of his wife and daughter. Michael Camello, the arson expert, was called to the stand.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
What would have happened had that spike penetrated that gas tank with the gasoline, the gas tank, and that rope on fire?
The gasoline from the gas tank would have poured out onto the burning rope, and it would have ignited.
The idea was to make it look like a drunk driving accident, he said,
Now we have the
and it might easily have worked.
And in the passenger.
The burning rope under the car, the pools of gas inside the vehicle, and the metal spike would have worked together to create an explosion so intense as to destroy all the evidence.
Depending on the amount
These items of evidence, in fact, were so soaked with gasoline that even years later, they were still a fire hazard.
consuming the lower or underside of the car.
Both the prosecutor and defense attorney agreed not to bring them into the courtroom due to the danger they posed.
And in the passenger.
From his seat behind the defense table, Peernock watched as the most compelling witness for the prosecution took the stand. His daughter, Kathleen.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
I'm going to take you back to the afternoon before the crash. Can you tell me what was going on that afternoon?
Well, when I got home.
For 3 days, Kathleen testified about the horrific events that took place on July 21st, 1987.
Much about it.
In what tone of voice did you make that comment about him wasting electricity?
I was being sarcastic.
So why did you say that?
Because
She told about the argument she had with her father when she came home that day, and how he suddenly became violent.
and he started to strangle me around the neck.
And he was yelling and screaming, and he dragged me into the living room.
Kathleen still remembered the taste of the plastic tube in her mouth and choking on the alcohol he forced down her throat.
And I had no control over what was happening, and he jammed a plastic tube down my throat and force-fed me alcohol.
After several
At this
hours,
point,
she began to
he
fade
talked
in and out of
himself into me,
consciousness.
trying to calm me down.
Her last memory was of being placed on a seat in a car.
I just couldn't deal with it anymore, so I...
She thought she could hear her mother breathing beside her. And she heard other sounds, like
And
someone
I
tinkering in the
made a
trunk.
remark about him wasting
The thing about her testimony was that she could only give us so much. So she stops at a particular point. She doesn't know who drove the car. She doesn't know who moved her from the back seat to the front seat. And she doesn't know what happened to her once she is moved.
I wasn't any longer conscious of what was really happening.
Thank you.
Defense, your witness.
Defense attorney Donald Green was looking for any contradictions in her testimony, any hint of dishonesty
Peernock.
which could be used to argue reasonable doubt.
You really didn't like your father very much, did you?
No, I didn't.
And you're currently suing your father for $5 million. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The
Did
defense
you
tried to
frequently
show
argue-
that Kathleen was looking to capitalize on
Yes.
her father's
Did you argue
arrest.
with your father frequently?
Yes.
Say, once, twice a week would not be unusual.
Green suggested that his client, like many fathers, often argued with his daughter.
Is that correct?
After 8 weeks, with the testimony of over 24 witnesses and scores of exhibits entered into the court record, the prosecution rested its case.
Defense, your first witness.
Defense calls Robert Peno, Your Honor.
In a criminal trial, a defendant cannot be compelled to take the stand. But when the defense announced their decision to call Robert Peernock, Deputy District Attorney Craig Richman welcomed the opportunity to cross-examine him.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth?
He thought he was smarter than everybody and could use his intelligence to get him out of this, as he had so many times before.
Swear to tell the truth, the whole
And
truth,
I wasn't going to
nothing
let
but
him.
the
There
truth,
was
so
no
help you
way
God.
that I was going to let him do that.
You may be seated.
Before the prosecutor would confront Robert Peernock, however,
Peernock.
the defendant, under questioning from his own attorney, would finally get the chance to tell his version of what happened that fateful night.
Yeah, about that. And
Against the advice of defense counsel, Robert Peernock took the stand to tell his story in his own words.
Or with your daughter or...
He was charged with beating his wife and daughter, then placing them in a car rigged to explode. But his daughter, Kathleen, survived to testify against him. Contradicting Kathleen's testimony, he said he never had an argument with her on the evening in question. In fact, it was mother and daughter who quarreled that night.
I go back in the house, next thing you know, to get a drink of water, and there's nobody there.
He saw them drive off in his Cadillac Eldorado.
What was that?
Realizing a divorce was inevitable, he tried to withdraw $50,000 from his bank the next morning. Peernock claimed his wife had agreed to take that money as a quick and clean divorce settlement. According to his testimony, after learning of the accident and his daughter's wild accusations, he felt his only recourse was to leave town and then determine how to prove his innocence.
I knew that if I could get to him, he would go off. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make him go off so that the jury could see what kind of person he was. And they could see what a violent person he was.
Thank you, Mr. Peernock. Any more questions, Your Honor?
Prosecution, your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor.
The prosecution questioned the defendant about his previous jobs working with explosive devices.
When you work for Network Electronics.
Investigators had learned that one company Peernock had worked for produced devices similar to the L-shaped spike, that was found on the undercarriage of Peernock's Cadillac when authorities arrived at the accident scene.
I was vice president, did testing of explosive devices.
And one of those devices was called a cutter. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but there were many others too. And there were no explosives on that vehicle. So please stop trying to mislead the jury.
Mr. Peernock, just answer his questions.
Trying to get the truth out here, Your Honor.
Mr. Peernock, I am
The judge
warning
reprimanded the defendant on several
His questions
occasions
and
for his
nothing
rambling
else.
and evasive responses to questions.
He just kept getting worse and worse and wouldn't answer the questions that I was asking him. Went because he had to tell his story, and that's all he would do. Every question I would ask, he would go off on a tangent to what he wanted to say.
So the police are trying to frame you.
Sir, I blew the whistle on corruption on state contracts that were wasting millions of taxpayer dollars. Since then, they've done everything they can to place these false charges against me.
Mr. Peernock, I'm going to warn you again. Keep your remarks to his questions.
Richman tried to get Peernock to respond to the many notes and lists they had found in his car.
Is this your handwriting?
Some of it might be mine, some of it might not be.
Author Anthony Flacco described Peernock's courtroom antics.
He would start very calm, very reasonable. He'd start by explaining, no, this point is false and this point is true. But when confronted, he would immediately turn, start shouting, start screaming, gripping the chair, looking like he was going to come out of the witness stand and being just this close to attacking people physically right on the stand.
Was Claire drinking when she came home that night?
Yes.
But you heard testimony from her coworkers saying that she hadn't had anything to drink. Didn't you?
Yes, I heard that.
So was she lying?
Practically everybody on this witness stand that testified for you, their testimony has been changed. I have a tape recording of a witness whose testimony is entirely different from what it was here.
Mr. Peernock, one more outburst from you, and you will be removed from this court. Do you understand me?
Sir, I have a few more issues I need to address before this court.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may now leave the courtroom until further notice.
The jury needs to hear that Mr. Green does not work for me in the least.
Take this defendant.
This whole thing is rigged. It's about millions and millions of dollars.
Fed up with the meandering, unresponsive, and often belligerent testimony of the defendant, the judge excused the jury and had Peernock forcibly removed from the courtroom.
This man does not work for me!
With little other recourse, the defense rested its case. The jury reached a verdict in less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts.
All rise.
Before sentencing, the judge ordered the defendant cuffed and gagged. As
Mr. Robert
Peernock
Peernock,
repeatedly
you are
banged
sentenced by
his head against the table, the judge sentenced him to 22 years, 4 months, to be followed by life imprisonment, then another sentence of life without the possibility of parole. It is my most steadfast recommendation, the judge added, that Mr. Peernock never be allowed back into society, and I recommend that no future governor ever parole Mr. Peernock. The judge went on, strongly advocating that Peernock be placed in a high-security prison. He was shipped to Pelican Bay, a high-tech, maximum security prison in California.